back to Whiskey Gal. Thanks for joining me again. If you're new to this channel, definitely go and check out my previous videos. They're going to be about breaking down what whiskey is, what scotch is, what single malt is, and just going into some interesting detail and different parts of history as well. And if you like what you hear, definitely subscribe so you can continue learning with me. The other day I was asked to break down how whiskey was made in a really simple Cliff Notes version. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to break it down and then we'll get into more detail in later videos. Everything starts, of course, with your grain, whether you're using corn or wheat or rye or barley. Now, if you're making a single malt whiskey, of course, you're going to use your malted barley. Now, the malted process is you take your barley and you add moisture, you add heat, and you allow that grain to germinate. You hear the noise in the background, that's just the dog. He's walking back and forth. Okay, so you allow the grain to germinate. So that germination is creating an enzyme or a protein, which is going to allow those starches to turn over to sugar later on in the process. Now, once that germination happens, you have to dry the grain. Now, if you wanted a smoky whiskey, you would actually take peat moss to smoke the grain during the drying process. And that's where that smoke starts from. After the malting process is done, that grain is sent to different distilleries. Now, distilleries get it, they grind it up into a coarse ground flour, and they put it into a mash tun. So in the mash tun, you're putting in a whole bunch of water. The distillery I work at, we're using 1 ton of the coarse ground flour at a time with 6,000 liters of water. So then we're just going to cook it. We cook the grain. During that process, all those starches in the grain turn to sugar, so you get your sugar water. Now the sugar water gets strained out and then pumped into fermenters. In the fermenters, we're going to be adding our yeast. Now, after a few days, we've created beer. That's all it is. So it's good to know that whiskey is actually just distilled beer. So it's the same process. So we're making a beer. It's usually like it can taste a bit citrusy. Now you take that, after you get your beer, you're going to put it into your first pot still. Now single malts are usually distilled twice, but you can get a triple distilled single malt as well. But generally, they're going to be distilled twice. So you usually have a pair of pots. So if really in the first pot, you're just taking out the majority of your water. You're basically taking your amount and almost cutting it in half. Half of it's just water. The water comes out and you're left with your alcohol. Now, the alcohol can vary a little bit, but it can be up to like 25% alcohol. From there, it gets transferred over to the next pot. Now, the next pot is a little bit more complex. It takes a little bit longer and there's different stages to it. The first alcohol coming out is going to be what's called your heads, and that's all your methanol. So have you ever heard of moonshiners going blind in history? It's because they left the methanol in and they drank it. So you definitely do not want to drink it, and you won't want to. It doesn't taste very good. So as soon as the still comes up to temperature, the heads are gone. Okay, so methanol you don't have to worry about anymore, and the smell of the liquor becomes more neutral. And then we have our hearts come out. Now, the hearts are the good stuff. That's what we use for a lot of our simple processes. If you're only aging a whiskey for a short amount of time, you're going to use your hearts primarily. Then after the hearts come out, you get your tails. So tails are another matter. They're a little bit more of a bite to it, definitely a different flavor profile. And I always liken it to the end of a beer bottle. You know, that last little sip is never as good as the rest of it. It doesn't mean it's bad for you. It's just not as good. Now, you can definitely use those tails, but you have to be more specific on how you use them. So if you're going to put them into a barrel, you need to make sure that barrel ages for longer than your minimum. So it needs time to soften in that barrel and become something drinkable, but you can definitely use it. After it comes out of your second pot, it goes into another tank. That tank is where you weigh everything. Then from there, it gets put into barrels, okay? Now, the barrels you got to be careful with. You got to make sure you pick out the right barrels. They can't be sour, so it's a really particular process. And you got to think about, too, about 75% of your flavor comes from the barrel, so you know how important it is, right? So pretty important. Now, before we put the spirit into the barrels, we need to bring down that percentage of alcohol a little bit, because usually it's coming out at 75%. That's a bit high, so we're going to bring it down to about 65% before it goes into the barrels. Now, that's just by adding water. So from there, it's going to have to sit in the barrels for a certain amount of time. Now, every country is different, but generally for a single malt, or for Canada, for most of the world, it's a little minimum about 3 years. And I know the States can be 2 years, or they don't really have a minimum as well for some of their qualities of whiskey. Now, for here, after your 3 years or 5 years or however long, you can play with your whiskeys as well. So after it's actually become something and sat in that barrel for a little bit, you want to finish it in different barrels. So you can use X wine barrels, X sherry barrels, X port barrels, X rum barrels. You can get really into it and have a lot of fun and being creative. You can see why you need a pretty good palate for that, and probably a couple of different people going through that process, because it's a big job. After that time, everything, of course, after their finishes, however long they want to age for, it gets watered down again and bottled. Now, usually when it's coming out of the cask, it's going to be at cask strength. So that's pretty high. Can be 63%, can be 58%, but it's usually a little higher than the majority of people want their whiskey to be. But there are people that love their cask strength whiskeys, and that's all that they will buy. Now, I can appreciate a good cask strength whiskey, but I think in general, I'll probably drink something a little bit on the lower side. In Canada, we're usually 43% alcohol, but of course, there are some people that are up to 46%, and that's lovely too. It just depends what you're used to and the different profiles that you're looking for. Now, when you add water to bring it down to those 40%, you have to let everything rest, right? Everything needs resting stages between each port, because that is what softens your whiskeys and what integrates all those flavors together. Now, after we're done, of course, bringing that down, it's going to be bottled. Now, that is the basic process, right? That is just a really rundown, but of course, there are little differences you can get. Like there's many different kind of pot stills you can get. Column stills would be a different process altogether, but we're talking about just the traditional pot stills for here. You could also do a sour mash. Now, that is something different altogether. Now, we'll go into all that later on, but that's just your brief description for you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Cheers!